Hi, everybody. Today we're going to continue this debate on defining white-collar crime, and we're going to look at two different kind of perspectives here. One of Edwin Sutherland, who developed white-collar crime, and his argument as to why white-collar crime is in fact crime. And then we'll look at Paul Tappan, who argues that while white-collar crime might be bad or socially injurious, it really doesn't reach that level of crime. So we're going to start off with Edwin Sutherland's argument, and then about halfway through this lecture, switch over to Paul Tappan's. So the very first thing here is defining what is a crime, right? This is one of the important elements here. If we're going to decide if something is a crime, we have to know what a crime is to see if it fits the definition. So what is a crime? What counts as a crime and what does not? How do we determine what a crime is? And this really basically comes down to the arguments between Edwin Sutherland and Tappan. If you have different answers to these basic questions, then what falls into those categories is inherently going to be different. So in terms of these definitional issues, Sutherland received a lot of criticism and a lot of grief for proposing a new theory and suggesting that white-collar crime is in fact crime. Those who even accepted white-collar crime as crime and were okay with the idea of it being criminal thought it should be studied under established criminological theories, though, and did not particularly care for Sutherland's new theory. So what Sutherland did is, in examining the 70 largest corporations in the United States at the time, discovered that all had violations of the law in some capacity, but only 9% of these violations actually violated criminal law. So this was evidence, or maybe supported the idea, that maybe a lot of white-collar crimes were not in fact criminal, or there was not laws prohibiting them. However, Sutherland argues that legal scholars define law as socially injurious and having a legal provision of a penalty for the act. So there are all sorts of things that we might argue are socially injurious, right? If you ask your grandparents, probably more so than even your parents, right? But your grandparents growing up, if you had piercings other than in your ear, if you had tattoos, those were considered bad signs or socially injurious in some capacity, right? However, there was no real legal provision against those, so they weren't necessarily criminal, right? So legal scholars make it a very clear point that it has to be socially injurious and have a legal provision for a penalty of the act, not just socially injurious. So Sutherland goes through several different laws and paints a picture of different white-collar regulations as socially injurious and shows how they do involve a penalty for the act. So for example, false advertising is very much the same as fraud. Infringement is very much the same as larceny. Punishments for antitrust laws could be jail time, fines, or payment of damages to the injured party. Any one of those things is technically a penalty, right? So he argues if there must be a legal penalty for the act, that legal penalty could be a civil penalty or it could be a criminal penalty. The actual punishment in practice is not as relevant as the fact that it is punishable. So often, corporations agree to a settlement or some other non-punitive sanction to avoid the criminal charges. Much like a lot of times, street criminals will agree to a plea bargain for a lesser included charge in some capacity in order to make sure that they don't have as severe of a punishment, right? Does that make it any less criminal? Sutherland argues, in fact, no, it does not. In the implementation of white-collar crime, it's also done differently than that of violent crimes, right? For example, if you rob a bank, the only remedy is criminal court. This does not require bank robbers to pay restitution. There are no other possible punishments. However, white-collar crimes, civil court is an option because businesses can pay out damages to the injured party up to 3 times the injury. Because of that, it's actually better for the victims that the white-collar offenders are tried in civil court instead of criminal court because they get restitution. Also, it's better for the company because they do not get charged criminally and therefore their reputation doesn't actually suffer. So for both the victim and the offender, handling these issues in civil court is actually viewed as much more positive. White-collar violations also avoid the stigma of normal or street crime. Whether this is right, whether this should be the case, doesn't really matter. Sutherland just argues that because they opt for civil court, they avoid stigma, therefore they're not viewed the same way. He continues that there are 3 factors that explain the differential implementation of the law with white-collar crimes. the status of businessmen, the trends away from punishment, and organized resentment of the public against white-collar crime. And we're going to go into detail about all these right now. So, the status of businessmen, right? Right off the bat, right, there's this concern that tough regulations may lead to less campaign donations from politicians, right? Typically, if you want campaign donations as a politician running for office, you want wealthy people to be the ones to give you campaign donations. Well, for wealthy people to give you campaign donations, they have to like what you are saying. If you are regulating them heavily or trying to punish them in some capacity, they're probably not going to donate to your campaign as much, right? And so there's this status of businessmen where you want them on your side to get their monetary support for your campaign. Also, the public in general has a really hard time seeing businessmen as criminals. And the same is true for politicians, right? For politicians, they probably went to the same schools, run in similar social circles, maybe are part of the same country clubs, right? Their kids are friends, and so it's hard to view someone you associate with all the time as criminal. But even for the public, right? We've seen movies like The Wolf of Wall Street and Catch Me If You Can. These are movies about people's criminal acts and their perfection of their criminal acts, and yet we're still kind of rooting for them throughout the movie. Right? Because they're living these extravagant lives and they're kind of, living lives that we kind of wish we could live and have the kind of money that they have. There's also this confidence that businessmen will conform due to public pressure. That if society doesn't like certain behaviors, businessmen will just naturally kind of conform to that public pressure in order to keep customers, because the customer is always right, and therefore we need to keep the customer happy, which is typically society. There's also been this kind of trend away from punishment. And so why has punishment been viewed since about the 50s and 60s as less ideal than other forms of punishment? Well, one is an increased power of lower classes. Before World War II especially, but it even started to kind of erode during World War I, class and differential classes really kind of took a hit. It used to be that you tried and you strived to become a member of the upper class. Now, especially in today's society, if you are a member of the 1%, you're viewed in a very critical way. There's also an increased inclusion of upper class people to penal sanctions, right? Especially after World War II, we started saying we don't care how powerful you are, how wealthy you are. We saw the kind of perfection of upper class issues in Nazi Germany. We don't like that anymore. And so we're going to start punishing these upper class people more strongly also. There was also this realization of the failure of penal methods to reduce crime. Locking people up in prison just wasn't working. Harsh punishments for people was not working. And so why are we going to continue doing it? And also the idea that pain-controlled behavior really started to weaken. Underlying all of this is the idea that pain punishment in the home, the school, church was all disappearing, right? There was not as much cultural support for penal methods in white-collar crime as white-collar crime started to become more talked about, right? And so white-collar crime kind of came onto the scene in this time period, in this social environment of this trend away from punishment also. White-collar crime, as Sutherland has argued before, is not really any different than juvenile delinquency. However, juveniles, unlike white-collar offenders or wealthy, politically connected offenders, do not have the power to protect their name and their interests, and therefore are typically lumped in with normal criminals. When we think of juvenile detention centers, we think of them like prisons. When we think of white-collar offenders, we think of them very, very differently than we think of even juvenile offenders. And finally, there was this kind of unorganized resentment against white-collar criminality. Murder is really easy to understand. Rape, burglary, theft, right? Arson. These are all very easy crimes to understand. You killed someone that you had no right killing, therefore you're in prison. White-collar crimes are extremely difficult to understand. If I were to ask any of you, what happened with Enron? Or how did Bernie Madoff get away with his Ponzi scheme? We might have a very surface level understanding of what happened, but to really get into the nitty gritty of it was extremely complicated and complex. And so if you don't understand it, it's really, really hard to get outraged about it, right? Typically only people within the profession understand it, and even then it's only advanced people within the profession. So an organization may be deviant for over a decade before everyone even notices that. If that's the case, during that time it might become a standard of the industry. Also, the injuries are spread out over time. It's not like a spree killer where a bunch of people are killed in a very short amount of time, we can be outraged about that. But if there's an occasional death here and there due to some sort of product default or defect, we are not going to be that as outraged about it because of the length of time between the instances. And if you think about it, right, the McDonald's hot coffee case, both of these issues were present. Number one, it was standard in fast food industry to make coffee much warmer than humans could drink it reasonably, and that's because McDonald's and other fast food restaurants did some research and figured out that a lot of people were getting their coffee at McDonald's but waiting to drink it until they got to work. Well, there's not much in this world that's worse than drinking cold coffee or room temperature coffee. Obviously, iced coffee is an exception to that. And so they were brewing the coffee extremely hot so that by the time you got to work, it was that ideal temperature to actually consume the coffee. Not only that, but Stella Liebeck, who was the McDonald's hot coffee victim, she was not the first case of someone to spill coffee on themselves. There was about 500 different cases of people getting serious burns from hot coffee spilled on themselves, but they were spread out over time and spread out in a lot of various locations. And so it was kind of an unorganized, disjointed injury map. And so people couldn't necessarily be as outraged by that. Also, business leaders tend to also be on boards that oversee business. And this is one of the ultimate kind of ironies. Bernie Madoff, one of the largest white-collar offenders in the history of the world, was chairman of the NASDAQ, was literally helping control and regulate the stock market as he was committing his Ponzi schemes, right? And so if business leaders tend to also be on the regulatory agencies, are they going to really enforce rules against their own companies? Probably not, right? So we're tempted to think that this is the only factor that really matters in terms of resentment, right? Or we're tempted to think that the only thing that really matters is this illegal or not? However, white-collar crimes are really distributed along a continuum. We know that there's mala in se crimes all the way down the line to mala prohibita, right? What does mala prohibita argue about moral culpability? So first of all, let's define these things. What is mala in se? Mala in se means the act is wrong in and of itself because it's a bad act. In this case, murder is wrong because killing somebody is a bad thing to do. We all know it's a bad thing to do. It's something about it inside our kind of spirit tells us killing somebody is a bad thing to do. Versus mala prohibita, it's wrong because we say so. If you're 20 years old, don't you dare have a drink of alcohol. But the day you turn 21, magically it becomes okay. Is there something inherently wrong about drinking alcohol? Not necessarily. It's just wrong if you do it under a certain age. So, mala prohibita argues what about moral culpability? Well, it kind of argues that it's only wrong because we've decided it's wrong, but it's not really inherently wrong in our spirit. Well, where do white-collar crimes fall along this continuum? Some of them seem very, very clearly mala and say that there's something inherently wrong about fraud, right? Selling something to somebody, promising it to do one thing, but it doesn't actually do it. However, other acts, it really seems kind of questionable. Is this really illegal, or is this really bad, or is it just kind of bad because we said it's bad, right? And so this also helps kind of cause this unorganized resentment, because sometimes people say, well, I don't really understand why this is a bad thing. I get that he shouldn't have done this or she shouldn't have done this, but I don't really understand why that was against the rules. And so that has also kind of helped with this unorganized resentment, which is why some people choose not to view white-collar crime as real crime. Now let's contrast this with what Paul Tappan argues in Who is the Criminal? This is an article that Paul Tappan wrote basically in direct response to this, saying we don't have a clear definition of what a criminal is in white-collar offending, and therefore we should not count white-collar crime as crime and the offenders as criminals. So traditional criminology has studied inmates. For example, Cesare Lombroso in Italy studied Italian inmates, right? And it became clear that these populations were not fertile populations to generalize, because obviously a lot of people who were not criminals were still committing, or who were not in prison were still committing crimes, right? However, regarding white-collar crimes, some criminologists believe that only those convicted under the law should be held as criminal. Well, there's a problem, an inherent problem with that idea, right? You can't just say that people who are convicted under the criminal law should be held as criminals, right? That's not adequate enough, which some have argued in white-collar crime, because in street crime, we don't do that. We rely on self-report surveys, and we know that the people in prison are just the criminals that have been caught, which is a biased sample compared to those who have not been caught. Others argue that criminology is the study of human behavior and therefore should concern itself with all antisocial conduct. For example, any behavior that's injurious to society in any capacity. So any behavior that violates social interest is crime. Of course, the problem then becomes that's too broad. Before, if you only study inmates, that's too narrow of a definition. Socially injurious behavior, that's far too broad, because what's socially injurious? Some argue that if you have millions of dollars or billions of dollars, that's actually damaging to society, even if you did, everything legal to get all that money. So that becomes too broad of a definition. Without a clearly defined category of criminal, though, anyone could be viewed as antisocial for some behavior. There are some religions that are viewed as antisocial. There are some political beliefs that are viewed as antisocial, depending on the group in which you belong, right? So we need to have an operational definition, woohoo for research methods, right, for what a criminal is. Tappan says, we've got this one side that's too narrow, this other side that's too broad, so let's come up with a definition of criminal and see if white-collar offenders fit into that definition. So a study of social control is important to the study of deviance. However, the studies of social control do not mean that the more specific study of law violation is insignificant. So we need to look at social control, right? But we also need to look at law violation and why people violate the law. So it's better to know why some people commit murder and theft rather than have a universal definition to fit all circumstances, according to Tappan. And so the idea here is, instead of trying to come up with general theories, which is what criminology more or less tries to do, right? The more broad the scope, the better the theory is. Let's try and solve some of these more specific, serious offenses and focus on those. If sociologists or criminologists want new categories of deviance, then that's fine. Let's make some new categories of deviance, but the way we do that is to advocate for law passage that makes them criminal. You do not just make a new category of criminal in a research standpoint that is not backed up by the law. So, white-collar crime, and Tappan criticizes Sutherland here somewhat accurately in this regard. It started off with corporate criminals, but the definition evolved to include almost anyone who put greed over need. Even if they were following the letter and spirit of the law, if they were in some capacity putting greed over need, that was a problem. So if this is the case, is the definition of white-collar criminal open to the interpretation of the researcher, or is it a clear objective definition? If it's open to the interpretation of the researcher, that's hugely problematic because we could define theoretically anyone as criminal. And in fact, that was one of the criticisms of Lombroso and the measurement of stigmata, was that depending on who was doing the measuring, you could find measurements that supported the person being criminal or not. And that became problematic. So Tappan argues that to not have a clear definition, the field is merely spewing ideology then. It's not actually science. It's just kind of our opinions on this kind of upper class versus lower class society. Also, deviations from the norm are not necessarily considered criminal. And what are some examples of this? Deviations from the norm could be just anyone who's very, very wealthy, regardless of how that wealth was obtained, right? That is a deviation from the norm. It could be argued that certain kind of behaviors, right, that maybe it's socially injurious to expect your employees to work 15 hours a day because they're not therefore being good parents and taking care of their children. If that's the case and there's a company that's doing that, is that company committing white-collar offenses by forcing their employees to work long hours? Well, maybe, but also maybe what's happening is if you're paid by the hour, you're choosing to work those long hours to make more money. That deviation from the norm is not necessarily criminal. So Tappan argues that crime needs to be an intentional act in violation of the criminal law, committed without defense or excuse, and penalized by the state as a felony or misdemeanor. That's a typo there, and should say or misdemeanor. Basically, law is a form of social control, and crime is a breach of that legal norm. It's not just a norm for society, but it has to be a breach of a legal norm. And Tappan here has quoted as saying, he may be a bore, a sinner, a moral leper, or the devil incarnate, but he does not become a criminal through sociological name-calling unless politically constituted authority says he is. And so Tappan basically says, while it's great that Sutherland's pointing out all these issues in society, and it's great that he's trying to talk about these problems, unfortunately, white-collar criminals aren't criminals unless it's a violation of actual criminal law, not that it has potential to be punished by the criminal law. So that kind of leads me with this question. What do you think? Do you tend to lean more with Sutherland, or do you think that Tappan is more correct? I'd love to hear what you think.